And we are live. Welcome, everybody, to an Artful Life, curious conversations about the ways humans make and use art. We're very excited today to have Dennis Keene with us, and my co host, Melissa, will make a wonderful introduction into what Dennis does.
Welcome, everybody, live and in the recordings. And I'm thrilled to introduce our guest, Dennis Keene, whom I met in 2017. He's a California native who is now one of the world's unequivocally, I messed that one up, one of the world's greatest experts on Kazakhstan who is not Kazakh, is what I'm trying to say. He has a degree from Stanford in Russian, East European, and Eurasian studies. He's been the host of a Kazakh national television program called Discovering Kazakhstan. And he's the founder of two companies, Walking Almaty and the one that most interests us today, Monumental Almaty. And we're here to talk about monumental art in Central Asia and in and of itself. And welcome, Dennis.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here to talk about monumental art, to explain what the heck that means. I'm a little bit at a disadvantage because I work as a tour guide, and mostly when I talk about monumental art, it's right behind me, and I can point to things and talk about it like that. So I'll have to paint some pictures for you for this place, Kazakhstan, that probably a lot of people don't know much about.
Exactly.
And we wanted to lead with that. Can you say a little bit about Kazakhstan and how it pulled you in?
So I went to Kazakhstan for the first time when I was a teenager. I was in high school and I was looking for travel abroad programs, and I found this organization called Youth for Understanding that had programs in Paris and Tokyo, and then I saw they had one in Almaty, Kazakhstan. And right away I thought, oh, that's just weird enough that I want to do it. And so I went and lived with the Kazakh family for a summer. Just thought it was fascinating. That was the first time I learned a foreign language, so I started to study Russian and Kazakh, and that really changed my life. So I went on to study Russian, studied Kazakh at Stanford 13 years ago, moved to Kazakhstan to further my Kazakh study, and I've been based there ever since then.
Wow.
How the heck did they even come to offer a Kazakh? Did they just have some families that said yes?
Somebody had gone over there and set up this exchange. Yep. And I remember a few years later, well, I guess about 10 years later, I was going back there permanently, and I wrote to them and I said, hey, your program changed my life. Like, if I can mentor any of these teenagers, just let me know. And they said, no, you were the only one to ever sign up for that.
Well, but it was 100% success rate, right?
I don't think they or my family or anybody thought that I would dive in as deep as I have, but that's just my personality.
Yeah. Wonderful.
What did your young self, what was it like to suddenly be in Central Asia in a home? What was that like?
The culture shock was extreme because that was really the first time I'd ever even spent a long time away from mommy. So a lot of it was just like getting used to being this young adult, right? Figuring out his own thing at the same time that Kazakhs are trying to give me vodka shots everywhere I go. And I'm like, I'm not 21 yet. And very few people back then spoke English. So it was a lot of being in that kind of permanent state of like not knowing what was going on, Yeah. And Almaty at that time felt very off the beaten path. It felt very Soviet. This is the city where I live now. And when I think back to that experience now, it feels like I was in this other world because Almaty has just become so modern and cosmopolitan. But it was, I got bit by the bug.
What year was that?
That was 2005. Which, by the way, important timeline moment here is that the next year is when Borat came out. And I think that that's one thing that a lot of Americans know about when they think of Kazakhstan. So I went there even before this film had come out. So the Borat jokes hadn't started yet. And ever since then, we've been struggling against that.
My God, that was one of the dumbest films ever in the history of all films. I couldn't finish watching it.
I couldn't either. It was just too revolting.
Yeah.
Insulting.
I made it about 10 minutes in, and then I was like, I have better things to do with my life than watch this.
Yeah.
But it certainly put Kazakhstan on the map in whatever, maybe not the best way, but yeah. But that's not what we're here to talk about. So when you went over in 13, Was this to just visit? Was this like I'm packing up all my things and I'm moving? How did that? How was that for you?
Yeah, no, I bought a one-way ticket, because imagine I had spent more than a year studying Kazakh, and this was intensive Kazakh because at Stanford, there was one person in the class, and it was me. It was me and the professor. Um,
I see
and
a theme here.
so I've been spending months and months and months like diving into Kazakh grammar and trying to improve my proficiency, but I only had one Kazakh person in the whole world I could talk to.
Mhm.
And I thought, okay, I just need to go in and fully immerse myself. And so I bought this one-way ticket, having signed up for the summer program to study Kazakh, but knowing that I wanted to stay, and knowing that having already studied Russian and then getting good at Kazakh, those were going to be these really good tools to figure something out. So the projects about art, about tourism are all in the future. It was just, I want to go there. I want to live it. I want to see what happens.
Mhm.
So then after that, I think in the order of Walking Almaty and Monumental Almaty were slowly born, but you started off just going there to learn. And then at some point you realized that you were not a traveler with a camera anymore. You had these projects. How did that come about?
Came about with the first summer there. Whenever I had free time that I wasn't studying Kazakh, I would just leave the house and go for a walk and walk around the city. And I would walk for hours and hours and hours and take pictures as I went. And I started to collect all these photographs, and I thought it would be nice to share them on a blog, and I called it Walking Almaty. And at that point, it was all about the urban landscape of the city. So I was taking pictures of the mosaics, which we'll talk about, but also of the trash cans on the street, the air conditioning units hanging from the buildings, the manhole covers, all these things that kind of stood out to me as what made Almaty special, and trying to learn more about the history, the architecture. So that's how it started. And then this blog, which I made for outsiders like me, became really popular with locals. They were like, who's this American guy who's walking around Almaty going to all these places that we don't go to? It took off on social media, and that eventually turned into this tourism business where I'm guiding people around the city.
It takes an outsider to see what's special, right, for the people that live there, actually. So you now run two businesses, right? So just give us sort of the lay of the land between the tourism part and the monumental Almaty's, and then we'll dive into the monumental Almaty a little more.
Yeah, so this is the 10-year anniversary of Walking Almaty as a tourism business.
That's cool.
Walking tour provider in Central Asia. I run guide training courses. I have other guides that work with me, but it's at the root of it, it's sharing Almaty with tourists and visitors to the city. So we have walking tours, we have food tours, and that's my bread and butter.
Food tour.
Yeah.
Whenever you guys visit,
Yeah.
tour on the house. One of our most popular tours is about art, and so there is some overlap here because actually it was pretty much the time that I met Melissa then in 2017 that I was really getting into Soviet art, because that had always been a big part of my website. When you document the urban landscape in Almaty, you can't avoid the public art that's everywhere.
Wow.
I was taking a lot of photographs of this, and I had always kind of set it aside as like, this deserves more attention and more research. And 2017, I hired an assistant, and we dug into the archives, into the libraries. We met artists, and we put together this project called Monumental Almaty, which is a digital catalog to the mosaics and monumental art of the city. And this is the first time anybody had ever really documented this as a genre of art, had really dug into the authorship of the works. And that then sprouted into like a larger advocacy project where now we do a lot of projects around restoring works of monumental art, saving them from destruction, educating, and so on.
Wow.
It's amazing to me that nobody had cataloged them before. It boggles my mind.
It boggles my mind to this day because they're everywhere. Throughout Kazakhstan, there's probably 1,000 of these murals and different works of public art. And there was one book that was published in the 1970s called Soviet Monumental Art of Kazakhstan. Because that was the time when it was being created. That was kind of the golden age, and I'm happy to go into the history of all of this. But by the time I arrived, right, in 2005, then 2013, this was such a different period because the Soviet Union didn't exist anymore. It had collapsed. Kazakhstan was newly independent, and people's relationship to not just the Soviet art, but to that entire period and to that heritage was very complicated. And I think of like the 90s and the 2000s as kind of the survival period when people were really just trying to get the country on its feet and trying to pay the bills. And in the hierarchy of needs, art had kind of diminished. But by the time I arrived, kind of Kazakhstan was growing, people were optimistic, and people could look at public art with fresh eyes and maybe reevaluate it.
Monumental art, obviously someone who doesn't follow art would assume that it means it's big, but there are other implications within the genre, right? It's installed on architecture is sort of a criteria, right? Either internally or externally on a building.
Yeah, so monument, this is like an exact translation from Russian, monumentalное искусство. And it's kind of awkward to say sometimes in English because we don't really have that, I think, as a phrase, unless you really know your art history. The closest parallel that I draw is public art. But when you think of public art, you might think of murals, you might think of some, sculptures and art installations. But what's important about monumental art, and you hit on it, Melissa, is architecture. Is that it's kind of the intersection between art and architecture. So it's art that's integrated into the built environment, often on a monumental scale, and that's where the name comes from, but not always. And it's not quite public art because a lot of the places where we go on our monumental art tours, for example, are private spaces, right? Like inside of a hotel lobby or inside of a factory or inside of a shopping mall. And then what do we call that? Well, let's call it monumental art.
Well, that sort of intersects with our next question, though, because when they were installed, it would have been the Soviet Union, and those would have been publicly held spaces. They would have been owned by the government, as everything was except your body. And so that brought us to our next question, which is the works that you're cataloging, these mosaics, sgraffito, stained glass sculpture, they were almost all created in the Soviet era. And I wonder, what was their relationship to propaganda?
Yeah, well, of course, there was always this communist ideology that was underpinning the creation of culture and art in the Soviet period. But there's a certain ideology that's underpinning all art creation of all time, right? When people think of Soviet art, they tend to think, if they have any reference point, it's like a propaganda poster, right? Or like a socialist realist painting of a factory worker or a farm worker. And that like very directly socialist realist style was more apparent in the fine arts, in oil painting and sculpture. But with monumental art, because it kind of rode this line between the fine arts and the decorative arts, it wasn't as in your face with the ideology. And the direct references to communism, Lenin, hammers and sickles, workers, are pretty rare. Like if people look at the examples on the website, Monumental Almaty, this one of Mr. Lenin is really the exception. And yeah, this is kind of what people assume they're going to find is lots of Lenins, lots of this communist imagery. More often, what you see is actually images from Kazakh folklore, images like this that are related to the place. And so I can tell you a story about this. This was in eastern Kazakhstan in the Altai Mountains.
Tell the listeners a little bit who are going to be listening on audio what they're seeing, what they're not seeing.
So what we see here is a form of bas-relief, so a sculptural work that's on a large wall in a cultural center, and it's made of carved wood. And this is the largest carved wood relief sculpture in Kazakhstan. It's in a city called Altai, that's in a region called the Altai. These are these mountains that span Kazakhstan, Russia, Mongolia, and China. And it's an area that was settled by old believers and Russian settlers going back to the 18th century. So they have a very rich kind of tradition of Russian folklore, of wood carving. And you see that in the work. So the work shows log cabins and farmers and foresters, and it reflects the city where it was made. What we don't see is propaganda per se.
Yeah.
But you know, when we think of propaganda, we think of them propagandizing the Communist Party. But instead, a lot of this art is propagandizing what they saw as Soviet values, a lot of which are just human values. It's about education, it's about art,
Tradition.
it's about tradition. Um, and monumental art was a way to reach this broad public in a way that you couldn't with fine art that was hanging on the walls in museums.
Yeah. I love the swirls too.
So I really wish that I could like take you around and show you all these, because and at the very least our listeners can look on the website to kind of scroll through the images and just realize how varied it is. And one of the big themes is that so much of it ties back to Kazakh folklore. And that was something I was trying to figure out, is what is special about Kazakh monumental art versus Russian monumental art or Uzbek monumental art, right? Because there were 15 republics in the Soviet Union, and each one had its own cultural traditions.
Should we look at the other one since we're at it?
Let's do.
Yep.
So I tried to select some images that would convey the diversity of media that these artists are working in. So mosaics are kind of the most iconic medium. And a mosaic just means it's an image that's made of these smaller tesserae, these little pixels. And those pixels can be a kind of colored glass called smalty. This mosaic that we're looking at of a cosmonaut kind of falling through space is made of natural stone, of these little river stones that have been assembled in the mosaic. But we'll see that there's different forms of bas relief. So we saw a carved wooden relief. There's relief sculpture made out of concrete, out of metal, out of ceramic, porcelain, stained glass, graffito. But this is a work that is a really iconic mosaic in a city called Karaganda. And Karaganda prides itself on being one of 3 cities in Kazakhstan that received the title of Cosmic Harbor. And it's called the Cosmic Harbor because cosmonauts would leave planet Earth from Kazakhstan, from the famous Baikonur Cosmodrome, this spaceport out in the middle of the Kazakh desert. And then they would land back on planet Earth in the Kazakh steppe. And the very first place they would be brought would be Karaganda. So it's kind of the welcome mat of planet Earth. So there is like this hotel in Karaganda where Tereshkova and all these famous cosmonauts would stay their very first night to kind of re-climatize to Earth. And all the most famous cosmonauts in history passed through this city. And cosmonauts were like the movie stars of the Soviet Union. They were celebrities. I think, a lot of Americans and people around the world maybe have heard of the name Yuri Gagarin because he was like the first man in space. But, people knew every name, knew every face. And the fact that they all passed through this one relatively small city in Kazakhstan was a big deal. So this is a big part of their heritage. So you see a big cosmonaut.
I love the graphic element. I mean, this is not a realistic picture. The figure's not drawn. It's proportionate, but it's not realistic. And the way that decorative shapes are used to show motion and how he fills the whole space. He's really important. It's beautiful design.
It has so much just dynamic movement in it, right? And this is actually one of those things that I always come back to when I'm kind of critiquing monumental art. Is does it bring this sense of movement and space to a building? Because it's a really hard task for an artist to have to put up a work on the side of a building, because buildings are big, they're heavy, they're static, right? And especially Soviet architecture, if you see the building, it's this classic prefab concrete apartment building from the 1970s, right? And how do you like breathe some life and some color and some movement into that? So the artist who did this is clearly did a good job at that. And then here we have another one. This is also on an apartment building, prefab concrete apartment block in the south of Kazakhstan in a small town called Shardara. And you have an image of a man in a trench coat, and he's holding out his hand and he's proselytizing something, but his face has been obscured. It's been painted over. Any guesses who that is?
Stalin?
Stalin. Me too. Yeah.
It could be Stalin, but Stalin had died in 1953, and after Stalin's death, the cult of personality around Stalin was dismantled in the Soviet Union, and so it's actually very rare to find Stalin sculptures or works of Stalin in public spaces. And the time frame for this, by the way, is that pretty much everything we're looking at and talking about today was built in the last 3 decades of the Soviet Union. So that's the 1960s, the 1970s, and 1980s. Okay. So this isn't Stalin. This is Stalin's predecessor, is Vladimir Lenin.
Okay.
And when this was put up in probably in the 1970s, they were celebrating Lenin's 100-year birthday, and it was called the Lenin Jubilee, and there were Lenins going up all over the place. But by the time Kazakhstan became independent, they were like,
"We're done.
How do we feel about this guy? I think we're done with this." So they've since redacted him.
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
Which brings up a question. I mean, do we know who the artists are who created any of these arts? Are these documented? Do we have names?
So all of these works of art were produced in this kind of state-run system of art production, where there was something called the Union of Artists, right? And to become an official artist in the Soviet Union, you had to be a union member.
I'm a member.
So you know this firsthand, right? And you will probably recall how there's a whole like entry exam kind of where you have to submit your portfolio. There's the Hudsoviet, the Artist Council, who reviews your works. But once you were in, you're in. It means you would get studio space, you would get art supplies. Anyways, the point is that there's documentation for all of this, because these were commissions that were submitted to the artist union, where, for example, they're building a new apartment building, and they like, oh, we need to have some art on it. And in a lot of cases, especially with like public buildings, there was a budget set aside for like 2 or 5% of the construction budget has to go towards art. So they would go to the local branch of the Union of Artists and say, we need this work. So there's a paper trail. The problem is that the archive of the Soviet Union, of the Artists Union in Kazakhstan, disappeared.
Oh my goodness.
There were some corruption scandals there in the 90s and early 2000s. The director of the Union of Artists must have absconded with a lot of these files, and they were never seen again. So
wow.
For me, that means that I don't have a lot to work with, and I'm very jealous of my colleagues who do this kind of research in other former Soviet republics, because they just go to the archives and they flip through the papers and like, oh, this is who it is.
This is fascinating, because the last time we spoke, it was 2017. We were talking about this, and you were hoping to get access to the archives and did not yet know that they were incomplete, if not non-existent.
So I found out there's not much to look at. And so what I had to do is basically detective work. I did as much as I can just going through books, and there's a good amount of books and journal articles and newspaper articles and such about this. So I could piece together some of the authorship details from that. And then a lot of it was just doing oral histories and interviews with the surviving artists. So I tracked down all the surviving artists in Almaty, where I lived, later did an expedition around Kazakhstan and met dozens of artists. And they, of course, could identify their own works. And then I would show them photos, do you remember who made this Lenin on the side of the building? And they're like, oh yeah, that was Igor.
That's Ahmed. Or
write that down. So that's a really big part of my work, is just figuring out the authorship. And this is so different, right, than a lot of other art historical research, where you have a work in an oil painting in your archive, and it comes with this kind of provenance, and you kind of know the story of where this comes from in most cases, right? But in this case, you start from zero.
Whoa!
Wow! I mean, fascinating, and yet, I mean, it's sad to think that just all disappeared.
There's one more image I want to have us talk about too.
I was actually looking at that, and I was thinking like that sort of probably maybe talks to the heritage of the region more so than anything else, right?
And these works, very often they reflected the setting that they were designed for. So what building was the sun. Because I should say that this is a mosaic at a tourist site in Almaty called Koktube. It's this tall hill in town where people take a cable car up to the top of the hill, and you get this nice panoramic view over the city. But this mosaic was not always there. So this mosaic has been moved from a building down the street where it was on the side of a souvenir store. And so the mosaic is showing a woman in traditional Kazakh dress holding up some earrings. There's an eagle hunter, bare-chested eagle hunter. There's some women holding up a carpet, right? So this was meant to tell you, oh, this is a souvenir store. Come inside and you can buy a jewelry and a carpet. I don't think you could buy an eagle, but they were trying to reflect this kind of traditional life.
Well, maybe you could book an eagle watching tour. Who knows, right?
Well,
Yeah, good
Willis
thought.
actually knows that in a past life I was a specialist in eagle hunting. So let's not go off on that tangent. I have very, very specific interest. So, but I actually want to tell you the story about this because this is a really interesting example of what we do with monumental art now, which is that we're able to save mosaics by moving them.
Wow.
And the whole way that we're able to move these is that they are made of modular elements. So let's imagine a more typical mosaic where an artist may be setting these little tesserae, right? These little tiles directly into the wall, right?
I see
Mhm.
these seams, yeah.
Yeah, so you could see this kind of grid in this image, and that's these large concrete modules, maybe like a meter by half a meter. And they would then be assembled on site. And so what this means is that we don't have to pick off the tiles one by one to save the mosaic. We just unhook the module. That's this concrete panel that has these rebar hooks on the back, and you just hook it off the building. So that means mosaics have become mobile. And it's been big for preservation purposes because, like in this case, who does this mosaic belong to? It was made for an apartment building that belonged to the people of the Soviet Union, right? It was a public.
Yeah, this was actually one of Nina's questions. How do you figure out who it belongs to?
I mean, property rights is crazy because everything got privatized in the 90s, right? So at a certain point, this belonged to a guy who owned the building, and then it all comes down to, well, does this guy care about this mosaic? Does he want to preserve the mosaic? And some people, can appreciate art and they can see the value of it, and other people are like, what is this old thing from this old souvenir store that used to be here? We want to build a coffee shop here, so let's just get rid of it. So the story of that mosaic is that the son of the artist was walking by the building one day, and he saw these workers hammering into his father's mosaic, and he nearly had a heart attack. And he went up to them and he said, what the heck are you doing? And they said, oh, well, boss said that we've got to do these renovations and we're getting rid of this. And he said, stop. And he took the pieces and brought them home and restored his father's mosaics. And this was like a big story, and a local philanthropist, Ajar Sandosova, heard about this, and she said, let me find a new home for the mosaic.
Wow.
But that is an amazing precedent for us, because now that we knew that you could kind of take these and remove them, when we do have a building that's under threat or the mosaic itself is under threat, we always know that we have this kind of plan B that you could take it and put it somewhere else.
The tiny part of me that wanted to be a lawyer, though, keeps thinking, so it's not on the apartment building anymore of the guy who didn't care about it. Who owns it now?
Excellent question. I don't think anybody knows. That field of property and art law does not exist in Kazakhstan. So
we need Marina Tarsis at the Center for Art Law.
I was just saying, it's an IP wet dream probably to figure out what this is, right? I mean, yeah.
Well, so just from our experience, a lot what it comes down to is a lot of handshakes and kind of just like good faith agreements that we don't want this, you can take it. So that's how it's happened in a lot of cases that we worked with. And then who owns it? Finders, takers, I guess. Whoever can take it and take care of it and be the caretaker for that work.
I would imagine that what you do needs massive funding. Who has interest in Kazakhstan or in Almaty to support what you do?
So In some cases, I can kind of appeal to the property owners and try to show them that this has value. It has commercial value because a lot of these works, if positioned properly, can bring in clients, can bring in tourists, right? It can add value to their property. In other cases, it means appealing to the local authorities. This is harder because Kazakh politicians aren't yet really ready to go on the line to advocate for Soviet heritage in Kazakhstan because it's still kind of a third rail.
Yeah.
And so more often than not, we appeal to philanthropists. And there's one philanthropist in Kazakhstan, Nurlan Smagulov, who's the founder of the Almaty Museum of Arts.
Oh, yeah.
And so he's been an advocate for this ever since I started Monumental Almaty.
Yeah.
So we've done 3 projects together where he has supported this.
Good for him.
Yeah, no, and I believe it's quite far-sighted of him because he realizes that this is a genre of art that was forgotten, that will become more and more well-known, and he's not just investing in the heritage of the country, but he's investing in kind of his own personal brand as it relates to this really fascinating type of art.
Yeah.
Do you think,
Go
sorry.
ahead.
Do you think that with a generation or two, that hang up of this is Soviet art will kind of maybe move a little bit more into the background and it'll become more something that the Kazakh people will embrace as part of their own story or history?
Yeah, definitely. And I can see that because that's happened in the 13 years that I've lived there, and it's happened in the time since these works were created. That I think of the 90s and the 2000s, I think we mentioned this as being this kind of like breaking point, right? Like the people's country had collapsed, the economy had collapsed, they had other things to worry about, right? And so that was a period where a lot of these works were covered up, and they would like put just drywall over the mural, and it was just it was a time of pain, of trauma, and people wanted to forget. And then as the economy grew in the 2000s and Kazakhstan kind of matured as a young state and as a young nation, there was this kind of emotional distance that people had to that heritage where they could look back on it and they could say, you know, maybe regardless of how we feel about the Communist Party and about these darker chapters in our history, this art was produced by Kazakhstanis. It was produced by our neighbors and friends, and by some of the most talented Kazakh artists in Kazakh history. So it has personal value to us. It has artistic value. It has historic value, and I think that we've seen this kind of reassessment of that, kind of a more just like objective, unemotional relationship to the art.
Does the tradition of monumental art, has that continued after the mid 80s, or did that kind of die with the support of the Soviet system?
The latter, because these are not cheap to produce, you know, like especially with mosaics, the main ingredient are these tiles made of opaque glass called smalty, and smalty is incredibly expensive.
Yeah.
And so you need to have this state system of art production to really finance those. And this is kind of true with public art everywhere, right? Like it's not cheap. You've got to pay the artist, you've got to pay for the supplies.
And then the time to make a mosaic of a wall of an apartment building out of pieces that are that big is a lot of man-woman hours.
It is. And they had a whole factory. It was called the Art Combine, where they had dozens of people working on this task, and that Art Combine doesn't exist anymore. It was shut down in the 1990s. So now, you know, for this art form to continue, you need to have a patron, right? You need to have someone who's willing to invest in this. And I can really only think of like 2 examples. The first example is that in Almaty we have a subway, and it's a quirk of the Soviet Union that subways were not just subways, they were underground palaces of art. And the Moscow Metro is world famous for its mosaics and its works of art. They replicated that in other cities. The Almaty Metro was started in the Soviet Union, but it was finished in 2010. And so in the 2000s, they invested in a lot of monumental art for the Metro. And so
good for them.
That, and they're great. And it really makes the Metro this just amazing space, and we do walking tours in the metro. And so there's an example of the city. It was probably the city investing in that art. And then the other examples that I can think of, because there's really only like a dozen examples of monumental art being created since the Soviet Union. It's usually like for restaurants, private businesses, where the business owner is just a lover of the arts, or maybe just a savvy figure who understands what kind of value this can provide, and they've commissioned.
Okay.
Yeah, but just like to put the scale, like put this into scale, like in the golden age of this Soviet monumental art, which was 60s, 70s, and 80s, they were creating hundreds of these. And I'm talking about Kazakhstan. So throughout the Soviet Union, thousands and thousands. They made more mosaics than anybody in the history of the world since the Byzantines. And then it just all came to a halt.
Nina and I were curious because I know that you live in Almaty in Kazakhstan, but you move around a great deal in the stans. And we were wondering if you saw something from Kyrgyz or Uzbekistan or Turkmenistan. Are their voices different than Almaty? Is there a pan-Central Asian voice, or what do you think about that?
In terms of the content, like the thematic imagery in the works, it's going to vary from place to place because it's going to reflect a lot of the local folklore. Okay. So, you know, in Kyrgyz mosaics, you'll see more Kyrgyz ornament from Kyrgyz felt carpets. In Uzbekistan, it's going to reflect this medieval Islamic architecture in what's called Chimney style. They have their own tradition of mosaic making, so you're going to see reflections of that. Overall, in Central Asia, if I would say there's like a Central Asian school of monumental art, you see a lot of color. And this was always encouraged by kind of Russian Orientalists' viewpoints in Central Asia, that Central Asia was just this place of color, whereas like Russia was very toned down and colder, and Central Asia was where you went for all your bright oranges and reds and yellows. So they're relatively colorful if you compare them to Russian mosaics. The biggest thing I see on my travels is just that, unfortunately, in other parts of Central Asia, the economy has not developed as much as in Kazakhstan. And so mosaics are still on the back burner for a lot of people. And so a lot of things have been lost. Whereas in Kazakhstan, because cities have grown and developed, like there are cases where people have said, like, let's preserve this. Whereas in Kyrgyzstan, it's kind of just, you'll see a lot of crumbling old buildings. And if the mosaic is still there, it's just a miracle of benign neglect.
Are you the only person in this whole area doing this, or do you have counterparts in other former Soviet republics?
So first off, in Kazakhstan, I'm not even the only one, because in individual cities, there are often local historians and journalists who've paid attention to this. So they deserve a lot of credit for doing their own detective work and advocacy work for that. In other Central Asian republics, there are similar art historians and just amateurs who document this, but it really varies from country to country. And a really interesting case is in Uzbekistan, because Uzbekistan has this new art and culture fund that was founded by the president's daughter. And the president of Uzbekistan is this reformer who's trying to really rebrand the country. And so he's given her this kind of blank check to transform culture in the country. And they have invested in monumental art. So they made a whole app about the mosaics of Tashkent, the capital city of Uzbekistan. You can go on the map in the app and see where all the works are, see who the artist was. That's amazing. I'm very jealous of that. They passed a law, and this is incredible. They passed the very first law in Central Asia, at least, about mosaic preservation. So they took several dozen works, and they're now on this kind of list of heritage in Uzbekistan, which means that they're protected by the state, and that's a huge step.
That's amazing. They've taken the bit in their teeth over there.
Yeah, but I also wonder if they've hired a lawyer and had the conversation that we were having, because I'm not sure in practice what that actually means, right?
How many pieces do you have cataloged on Almaty? Do you have a rough figure in your head?
Yeah, on Monumental Almaty, I think we have 120.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And in Kazakhstan at large, 600 that I could find. And so much of this is just kind of like an accident. I'll be on a train, I'll look out the window and be like, oh, there's a mosaic over there. And I'll put it on my or a lot of the work that I did is I reached out to these local communities. Most cities in Kazakhstan have what's called a publica, which is it's like a web forum where people hang out, and it's like next door of Kazakhstan. And I would be like, what mosaics do you have in your community? And people would tell me, oh, on my school there's a mosaic, and I would put all these pins on the map and find it that way. So all that is to say that I found as much as I can through those kind of that detective work, but I'm sure there's hundreds more out there.
Wow. So after 10 years of work, what do you now believe about the role of public art in any society?
I think it has a positive effect on people when you're walking to work, walking to school, going about your day in a city, and you see art. Because even if you're not paying attention to it, just having it there kind of plants the seed in people's minds. And it often can pass along those values that we were talking about before, right? So maybe if somebody walks by a mosaic of Kazakh folklore that's telling stories from a Kazakh folktale, they will then be familiar with that folktale, and they'll have some kind of emotional attachment to that heritage. Or if it's showing doctors on the side of the hospital, they'll appreciate more the work that the doctors are doing. And so it has this very kind of direct human ability to tell stories and to pass along these values. And I think it also just shows the priorities of a society when they invest in art being in those public spaces. It shows that they care more about kind of in Russian, they would often talk about it as like in spiritual terms, the spiritual, moral education of people, not just the capital kind of consumerist approach.
Yep.
I believe that too.
Yeah, I think it's really important. Yeah.
Nina, how is public art in Switzerland? How much is there? Is there much? I don't remember, other than the stained glass windows in the Fraumünster in Zurich. I don't remember much.
I mean, there's a fair amount of sculptures.
Okay.
But those would be privately, like, a bank displaying their wealth, or, a company, etc. I think we have, there's a huge market for, not really public, but public in that organizations will have a massive budget to buy art and display it in their lobbies, and maybe have an artist do a rendering of something on the walls outside. But I think the money the public art is more spent on an architecture firm like, Meurant, whatever their names are, or, to have the pieces of art be the actual architecture, but not a mosaic, or not an actual, picture depicting something on a wall. But there's a fair amount of sculptures, I would say. Fair amount of sculptures. And then we got the Alps, just kind of
well, there's that.
The sculptures. Yeah.
There's that.
I know that in much of Central and Eastern Europe, you can find also large amounts of this monumental art. Pretty much anywhere where there was either a socialist government or there were liberal parties that were invested in social housing and these public buildings, you see monumental art. Like I walked around Vienna one time with Adisa just in awe, because all of the public housing there that was built in the 70s has mosaics on it. And I had no idea, but it reminded me a lot of what I had seen in Kazakhstan.
Yep.
I love about the former Soviet Union. I lived in the former Soviet Union for 2 years of my life as a teenager, and don't get me wrong, I would never reinstate it, and the far majority of the qualities of the former Soviet Union were reprehensible, but there were great points about it. And one of the things were everybody had to go to work and the workload was distributed and people had free time. People worked like 33 hours a week, and you could, take off work and go for a picnic if it was a beautiful day. You had time. And the other thing, I'm sure there were more than two, but the other thing that I remember loving is that the Communist Party understood the power of art to inspire and maintain and lift up a people, and they funded their symphonies, their art schools, their murals, their ballet schools. And my husband is a product of that. He was singled out as an 8-year-old for his ability at that age and received a stellar education for 14 years for free, because the Soviet Union believed that art lifts up a people.
Mm-hmm. And they obviously saw it as an ideological tool, but I wouldn't reduce it to that. They saw it as just a tool of enlightening the people. That's the word that they used, right? So Soviet cultural production was very robust in any sphere, right? Like you were saying, from dance to theater to literature to art. But the flip side to that is that there was a certain framework that you had to work within. And it's called socialist realism, to the point where like that doesn't really mean that much anymore, but it should glorify the workers. It should be positive in its assessment of humanity. It obviously shouldn't like criticize the state. So it's kind of art for beauty's sake and for what they saw as the sake of truth, but defanged of any social component, right? That, in the sense that there's no social critique. And that's such an important part of art of the 20th century and 21st century, is this element of social critique. So that actually, I wanted to say a little bit about the current public art situation in Kazakhstan, where it's not monumental art per se, but it's street art. And so you have street art murals going up in cities all around Kazakhstan. And I guess you could group that under this broader term of monumental art. Well, street art, right, got its start with, or it really came into its own with Banksy and with, these kind of like punk underground, F the man type social commentaries that you can't have that in an authoritarian state like Kazakhstan. So in Kazakhstan, street art, every mural has to be signed off by the city government. And so we have street art, but they're all just very inane, and they're mostly like PSAs, like pay your taxes. And
the sentence before that inspired a question in me, and none of us will have the answer to it. But I'm a working realist painter, and in the world of realism at the highest echelons, you're not really considered relevant unless your work is a little bit disturbing. Like if you have good technique, then you need to present a slightly dystopian view. Like there's a painter, a British painter, she paints beautifully, Ginny Saville, I don't know how she says her last name. And she's a gorgeous painter, but it's like children with blood oozing out of their eyeballs and things. And there are hundreds of examples like that. And you just made me wonder if this is a hangover from when the Soviet Union was enforcing art is for beauty, and in the United States, we were different. Art is for social critique. Art is to have teeth and have edge. And if we've kept on holding our side of the seesaw down, even though the Soviet Union is now dismantled, if that's a legacy of a yin-yang world.
Well, I mean, you definitely wouldn't see art like that in the Soviet space, right? It would be very heavily critiqued by art critics, because Soviets saw art as something that should uplift, that should inspire, right? That should be beautiful. And they saw Western art production as being decadent and disgusting and morally corrupt.
Yeah.
But life is ugly sometimes, and life is disgusting sometimes, and life can be violent. And so that's probably the argument for that side of things, is show both sides. Because otherwise you just end up with classic Soviet pictures of just like smiling, happy workers. And like workers are happy sometimes, but they're also depressed sometimes. So
they're also oppressed sometimes.
Yeah. And by the way, like just to add some nuance to any discussion of Soviet art, when we think of Soviet art, we tend to think of the socialist realist style that prevailed under Stalin. So the art of the 30s, 40s, and 50s, where it was like the really kind of cheesy factory worker style. But in the 60s and 70s, you had this new generation of artists, and we call them 60 years or 70 years. And that was Stalin had died, Khrushchev had come to power. There was this thaw, there was this liberalization in the Soviet Union. And actually, people could show like some dark periods. And there are a lot of works from that period where the workers don't look like they're having a hard time. I mean, they don't look like they're having a good time. They look like they're really struggling. And it was kind of this more honest approach to the human experience.
And by the time I got to the Russian Academy at the late 80s, early 90s, you could do anything as long as it didn't say like F the state.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But could you be non-figurative?
Well, you could, but you probably weren't very smart if you were investing your time at the academy and you wanted to be non-figurative, and you wouldn't last there very long. But it wasn't because you were in political trouble. It was because they had nothing to teach you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Well, and think about if any artist has to support themselves, they have to pay the bills, and they're thinking about who's going to buy my art. Well, in the Soviet Union, who bought the art? The state. Bought the art, right? You were selling to the local museum and gallery, and they had very strict instructions on what kind of art was acceptable and what wasn't. So if you were an artist who was sensible like that, you learn how to play by the rules. But then there's, I'm sure you knew, Melissa, a lot of artists who just painted for themselves and for their friends, right? And that's where you get the really cool stuff, this kind of underground art. Because they didn't have to follow the rule.
Yeah.
With mosaics, that's a lot harder to do, because how are you going to make an underground mosaic? So someone's going to see.
Well, a little portable tile. I don't know. Could go on forever, but unfortunately, we need to wrap this up. And Melissa, do you want to ask our penultimate question?
Yes. If you were speaking to someone who wanted to become an activist to document and save artwork in their own sphere, what would you say to them? How should they prepare?
I think the first step is to do what I did, which is just to do a survey to understand what it is you're talking about. Because if you want to advocate for the preservation of something, you have to have that body of work already. And we kind of take it for granted that in other parts of the world, someone's already done that work for you, and you kind of know what you're talking about. If I take Los Angeles, there's already a dozen books that somebody's written about the public art of Los Angeles, and I can advocate for that. In other places, you may have to do that footwork stuff. And then the next step is probably to understand who are the stakeholders. So there's the local community, there's the municipal or regional government, there are people in culture, museums, and artists themselves, and understand what their relationship to these things are, and property values if we're talking about property owners, if we're talking about monumental art. And you need involvement of everybody, because if I, Dennis Keene, want to save a mosaic and the community and the property owner doesn't care, then is it really my role as a white savior to come in and be like, no, you got to save that mosaic? Like it only matters as so far as it resonates with people in those environments. So you have to get people to buy in from that.
So you have to have people skills too.
Yeah. And in today's age, social media makes that a lot easier, because you can appeal to people directly through those platforms. So that's a lot of the work that we do. It doesn't even have to come down to writing petitions or standing out of a place with a banner. I just make an Instagram post, and these things go viral because people are like, oh yeah, that mural, like I love that mural. What the heck? You're going to destroy the mural? And then you get people who really care about it to come together.
Yeah, that's cool. Good point. So there are some good parts of social media for sure. Our last question for you, Dennis, is if you had to choose one piece of art from your private collection that is in your home or in your office as your favorite, which one would you choose? And the way we always like to put it is, your house is on fire, you're running out, other than grabbing your wife and kids. Which piece of art comes with you?
Well, I'm at a disadvantage here because I'm not in my own home right now. So otherwise, I'd look around and I would go to you guys. Two things. one that there's a project that I worked on that is a collaboration that I did with a local artist in Almaty. His name is Roman Zakharov, and he's a very talented illustrator and designer. And we've made these series of posters together. So one is like an illustrated map of Almaty. Another one is what we call the alphabet of Almaty. So it's like A is for apples because apples are from, and we kind of go through the alphabet like that. So we have a series of these cool posters, and I'm very proud of those. So I'm sorry, I'd want to say our own work. And
Yeah.
the other one is actually a reproduction of monumental art. I do not have any of my own personal mosaics in my private collection, unfortunately. They're too monumental to fit in our little Soviet flat. But my friend, I had a German friend, Philip, who was living in Almaty, and he was a big fan of mosaics like I was. And he took these really cool photographs of mosaics in town, and he had them printed on canvas. And so I actually have this monumental mosaic from the city that he printed out, and it's hanging up in my house. It's a cosmonaut like flying through space. It looks very cool.
Wow. Cool. That sounds really, really lovely. Yeah, I mean, it's nice how you can like sort of make new art out of old art, right?
Yeah, and I wish that he was still around, because I think that people would probably like to have something like that.
Yeah.
And please tell our listeners where they can go to see the things we've been talking about.
Yeah, so specifically about my work, I have a website, monumentalalmaty.com.
Is it .com?
It's a .com. And if you type in just Soviet mosaics Almaty, or if you type in my name, Dennis Keen, a million different articles will pop up, so you'll see that. Then at large, I would encourage people to look up a publishing house called Dome Publishers. That's DOM. They're based in Berlin, Germany, and they have this amazing series of guidebooks to Soviet monumental art, different cities and countries around the former Soviet Union. So for a wide audience, that's the best introduction to this, because they're just these beautiful, full color, produced books, just full of photographs of mosaics and other works of monumental art. So that's a good place to start. And then I encourage people to visit this part of the world. It can sound kind of scary and unknown for people who haven't been to Central Asia, but Kazakhstan is incredibly safe, incredibly open and warm and welcoming, and it's having a moment. Like the city where we live is just blossoming culturally, and we have 100% satisfaction rate so far. I work in tourism, and everybody who comes is like, wow, I had no idea this place was amazing. So I encourage everybody just to come and visit, and when you do, I will take you on a tour.
May it not be a moment, but an age of blossoming.
The golden age.
You are a wonderful guest. I wish we had 3 hours.
Yes.
I wish we did too. Yeah, it's fun to talk about it.
Yep. Well, thank you so much for showing up, for sharing so generously with us, and we hope we'll have an encore at some point. And for those of you who listened live or the replay, thank you for joining us as well. And don't be shy; leave your questions in the comments, and or your comments. And we look forward to a next edition of An Artful Life next month. And bid you farewell. Thank you for listening. And
thank you, Dennis.
And thank you, Dennis, so much.